We're going to go ahead and move on. This is a project that we've been doing for 3 years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it as we go along. So how many people remember our fields that look like this? You can see quite a bit of weeds popping through there. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of those. But again, this was probably a field that might have been like pre-1996. So what happened in 1996? Roundup Ready soybeans, right? So, you know, that pretty much changed the way we were doing weed control. And, you know, whether right or wrong, it has changed the entire system. And, you know, we're starting to see resistance develop, so we're bringing back some of those other herbicides. But what we're seeing is, you know, Roundup Ready. And then in 2009, we had a couple new technologies, right? We had the Liberty Link soybeans that were registered. And then in 2009, we had a small release of the Roundup Ready 2 yields. 2010 was kind of the full-scale release. So we have these new technologies out here. So there were a lot of questions behind that. But first of all, I want to cover how these different soybeans actually are similar or different from each other. So with the Roundup Ready soybeans, the interesting thing is they're actually, the resistance in the soybeans are the same between the Roundup Ready 1s and the Roundup Ready 2s. And the way that those actually work is with both of them, glyphosate resistance in those are enzyme based. And basically what I'm saying is when glyphosate or Roundup is applied to a plant, it has to go through the plant and it looks for this enzyme right here, right? And once it gets to that enzyme, it blocks it and it stops production of these aromatic amino acids, which basically means the plant can no longer live. But with our Roundup Ready crops, for both the Roundup Ready, regular Roundup Readies and the Roundup Ready 2 yield soybeans, it has this insensitive enzyme that's in there, the CP4 enzyme, and that glyphosate can't bind to it. So that's why we see those Roundup Ready soybeans surviving. And it's the same for the original Roundup Readies and the Roundup Ready 2 yields. So what's the difference between the two? Well, the biggest difference is there's just a different insertion place for that particular gene in the Roundup Ready 2s, and then they put them into different varieties. So that's kind of the difference between the two Roundup Ready soybean varieties. When we look at Liberty Link, you can see here Ignite herbicide tolerance, and I'm going to tell you right now that that's going to be changed to Liberty herbicide tolerance. So in the last month, Bayer came out and said, we are now changing our name, herbicide name from Ignite to Liberty. So do you guys remember what we used to use on Liberty Link soybeans? Liberty, right? So it went Liberty, Ignite, Liberty. So we have a new novel concept, but this next year, if you're growing the Liberty Link soybeans, you will be applying Liberty herbicide. It will be the same formulation as the Ignite formulation that we've had over the last several years. So Liberty Link soybeans are resistant to the herbicide glufosinate or Liberty. The way that this particular system works in a plant, when Liberty is applied, it blocks this enzyme, this glutamate synthetase. And what really happens is it really starts to produce ammonium, and you get basically the plant desiccation, and it kills the plant. So in soybean, what happens is they have this gene, this PAC gene, and that's inserted into the plant. And when Liberty comes in, it basically is detoxified, so it is metabolized, and it doesn't encounter this enzyme, and that plant lives. So that's how the Liberty Link soybeans are able to withstand applications of Liberty. So just a little bit of background there. But the big thing, what we were trying to do was to answer some questions, because we have these new herbicide-tolerant varieties, or these new varieties that came out, and there were some actual claims saying, hey, you know what? These ones are going to outperform the current ones that you have. So we really wanted to answer these questions. How do these varieties compare for weed control, yield, and economic returns to current systems? So this is, again, a study that we've been doing that's been funded by the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee for the last 3 years. We conducted it at 2 locations on campus at the MSU Agronomy Farm, and then at the new Saginaw Valley Research and Extension Center up by Richville. It was a pretty big study. We had 2 different factors. We had soybean traits, and our traits were non-GMO, Liberty Link, the current Roundup Readies, and the Roundup Ready 2 yields. and we had 4 varieties of each one of those. So we're looking at 16 varieties in this particular study. I will point out that in 2009, because of the limited release of the Roundup Ready 2s, we only had 1 variety that first year. The next thing we looked at were 4 different weed control strategies. The first one was kind of what we considered a standard pre-emergence program. We just wanted to control the weeds there, just wanted to see what the yield potential was for each one of those different varieties or traits. We also had 2 other ones that were dependent on what the herbicide trait was, a pre followed by a post application, and then a 2-post program. And then we also had a non-treated in there to see how well some of those varieties would actually perform under weed pressure. And interestingly enough, we did see some of the newer varieties actually did yield pretty well under some pretty high weed pressures. So in 2009, we had a total of 52 treatments, and in 2010 and 11, we had a total of 64 treatments. So it was a very large study. You can see the planting dates. We usually try to plant around the 1st of May, but with the rainfall that we've had over the last several years, you guys have probably dealt with that too. You can see the planting dates were more towards mid to late May. The row spacing was 15-inch rows, and the seeding rate was 175,000 seeds per acre. These were the different soybean varieties that we looked at for the different technologies. You can see the non-GMO soybeans that we looked at. These were the same for all 4 years. When we were picking varieties, what we did is we looked at the MSU performance trials and also looked at some of the out-state trials and picked some of the 4 highest yielding for each of the technologies, and we also wanted to have similar maturities across the different traits. So those were our non-GMO soybeans, our Liberty Lake soybeans. We had a change out after 2009. This is one that was no longer going to be sold, so we switched that out. Had the same thing happen with the Roundup Readies, but you can see the different varieties that we've used. And then the Roundup Ready 2 yields, this was the one that we used in 2009. They didn't sell it in 2010, so these are the 4 varieties that we looked at in 2010 and 11. And again, these were amongst some of the higher yielding in our in the state performance trials. Our herbicide treatments, this was our standard pre. Again, we just wanted to try to get good weed control, and then in some cases we would come back and supplement a little bit with some hand weeding. Again, just wanted to see across the different traits how well they performed without putting Liberty on the Liberty ones or Roundup on the Roundup beans. Our pre followed by post treatments. On campus we used the Valor XLT, and then up at Ridgeville we used Valor at 2 ounces, and a lot of that was because up in this area, in that area, we have some rotation restrictions where Valor XLT probably wouldn't work as well, so we used Valor, which we could rotate to some crops like sugar beets and others. In the non-GMO soybeans, we used the pre followed by FlexStar plus some Flex Max. In Liberty Link, we would use that pre-emergence of either Valor XLT or Valor, followed by Ignite or Liberty. And then the Roundup Ready systems was the pre followed by Roundup Power Max. And then our 2 pass post systems in the conventional was Raptor followed by FlexStar plus Select Max. Liberty Link would have been 2 passes of Ignite or now Liberty, and then the Roundup Ready systems would have been 2 passes of glyphosate. We did see some initial crop injury from some of our pre-emergence applications, and really where it was a major factor was just in East Lansing in 2009. We had quite a bit of rainfall. We had 4 inches within the first 2 weeks, and we were on a little bit higher pH soil, so we did see quite a bit of injury from that Valor XLT. Did not see that in 2010 or 11, and we had no injury from the Valor at the Saginaw Valley location. From post-emergent standpoint, the only place where we saw injury was with our non-GMO soybean herbicides. Raptor, what you would generally expect, about 10 to 20%, and then that was basically those soybeans grew out of that by 28 days after treatment. So kind of typical injury that you would expect. The weed populations at the different sites varied. You can see a very high weed population down here. At East Lansing, we had a range depending on which year, but anywhere from about 55 weeds, and a meter squared is about the same size as a yard squared, up to about 900 weeds. So there's, pretty big difference there. in weed populations, but again, these would cause significant reductions in yield. The Saginaw Valley location, our first 2 years, we had basically less than 5 weeds per yard square, and in that case, you're going to see what the results look like, but in many cases, we probably wouldn't have needed to treat the field with a herbicide. In 2011, we had about 32 weeds per meter squared. Looking at weed control, all of our herbicide treatments worked well, and we had good to excellent weed control from those treatments. So we're going to report the yields now. This is just kind of showing you the range of the soybean yields averaged over the 6 locations for each of the traits. So in each one of these, you're going to see all 4 varieties over all 6 locations. And so this is a non-GMO, and you can see the range anywhere from a little over 30 bushels per acre up to about 85. And when you look at these boxes, really what you're seeing is 50% of the data is in the boxes, and this is kind of a mean soybean yield for the non-GMO, so 60 bushel. And usually when we look at these boxes, the smaller the box, the more consistent the data. The Liberty Links, the mean average was 66 bushel, the Roundup Ready 64, and the Roundup Ready 2s 67. Some of the differences that you see in the range of data can be explained by the precipitation up through pot fill, and you can see here is kind of our 30-year average. And in 2009, we had a little bit less at the Saginaw Valley location, quite a bit of rainfall at the East Lansing location. Same thing in 2011, a little bit lower again at the Saginaw Valley location, and then we kind of had a drought year in 2010, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to conduct this again, because there were very little differences in yield in 2010. So the weed control systems did affect yield, and what we're going to do here is look at the individual locations and look at how well each one of these weed control systems works. And at the end, so here we see that our 2-pass post system worked the best, and this is averaged over all the traits in East Lansing 2009. At the Saginaw Valley location in 2009 and 2010, even our non-treated was amongst the highest yielding. And again, remember, we had very little weed pressure at this location. In East Lansing 2010, East Lansing 2011, and the Saginaw Valley location in 2011, basically any of our weed control systems were amongst the highest yielding, so there were no differences. And if you look across here, you can see what effect rainfall had on our average yields. So probably the more important thing is, how did those soybean traits affect yield? So we'll do the same thing. We look at East Lansing 2009, we see that the Liberty Link soybeans and the Roundup Ready 2 soybeans, again, just remember there was only one Roundup Ready 2 variety in 2009, were amongst our highest yielding. At the Saginaw Valley location in 2009, the Roundup Readies and the Roundup Ready 2s were amongst the highest yielding. In East Lansing 2010, Liberty Link and the Roundup Ready 2s, again, were very similar in yield. Saginaw Valley location, no difference across any of them. And again, this is a drought year, and you can see by the yields they were a little bit lower. East Lansing 2011, Liberty Link and the Roundup Ready 2s, and then the Saginaw Valley location, 2011, Liberty Link and the Roundup Ready 2s. So if you just kind of look across the average, you see that our highest yielding only occurred in 2 out of the 6 locations for the non-GMO, 5 out of the 6 for the Liberty Link, 2 out of the 6 for the current Roundup Readies, and then 6 out of the 6 for the Roundup Ready 2s. Again, remember there was only one variety here in 2009. Probably the more important thing is, well, we know what the yields are, but what is the economic analysis? Because remember, some of the seed premiums on some of these beans are a little bit higher. So what we did is looked at kind of where we would be going for this next year. So these were some of our fall seed premium rates. They might vary a little bit by company, but you can generally see, especially over the last year, we've seen that the Roundup Readies and the Roundup Ready 2s, that seed premium has gotten a lot tighter. It's not as big of a difference. So we're going to see some differences in economic returns than what we've reported over the last several years. And the Liberty Link soybeans, actually the premium has been it has become a little bit cheaper. We look at our weed control cost. We saw anywhere from $14 to about $36 for the pre-fall by post. And our two pest post systems, the herbicide cost was basically around $8 to $49, with our highest cost being with the non-GMO programs. Here, this is the application cost we used, $7.50. We used a December crop selling price of $11.50, and then for the non-GMO soybean premium, we used an average price of about $1. So, and that varies a little bit depending on what your contracts are. So we figured out the gross margins by basically using this equation, and we'll kind of look at and see what we saw there. So when we look at the weed control systems, the pre-fall by post or our two-pass post system, basically we saw no differences in 5 out of the 6 sites. In East Lansing 2011, we did see a little bit of lower economic return for our pre-fall by post, and I think a lot of that had to do with some of the soybean injury that we saw from our pre-emergence Valor XLT applications that year. When we look at the traits, probably some of the more interesting, important data, we see that in East Lansing 2009, Liberty Links and the Roundup Ready 2 yields, again, this is averaged over all the 2 weed control systems, were amongst our highest economic returns. At the Saginaw Valley location, the Roundup Ready and the Roundup Ready 2s were amongst the highest. At the East Lansing 2010 location, the non-GMOs and the Liberty Links and the Roundup Ready 2s were all equivalent. Saginaw Valley location 2010, the non-GMOs and the Liberty Links. And again, remember this is a drought year, so we didn't see any advantages to either of the Roundup Ready systems. The East Lansing 2011, non-GMO, Liberty Lake, and Roundup Ready 2s, and then the Saginaw Valley location, the non-GMOs, Liberty Lakes, and the Roundup Ready 2s were not different. So if we kind of summarize those, we see for the non-GMOs, economic returns, 4 out of the 6 locations were amongst the highest. The Liberty Lake, 5 out of the 6. Roundup Ready, there was only 1 out of the 6. And the Roundup Ready 2s, with the current economics, we saw 5 out of the 6 were amongst the highest yielding, economic returns. So kind of as a quick summary, our weed control programs, those 2-pass programs provided excellent weed control regardless of trait. We are still kind of promoting the use of using a pre-emergence followed by post. Again, resistance management as well as your increased flexibility. We're able to get out there in a timely manner to control those weeds before we see early season competition. With you guys having to deal with so many acres, it gets a lot tougher. So really, the soil applied products would help. Yield potential of the traits varied by the environment. We did see that the Roundup Ready 2s and the Liberty Links were amongst the highest yielding, and then the non-GMO and Roundup Readies were amongst the highest yielding in 2 out of the 6 locations. And under our current economic conditions, basically, the herbicide system was only significant at 1 location, and we saw the Roundup Ready 2 yields and the Liberty Links had the greatest economic return at 5 out of the 6 locations. And then the non-GMOs with those premiums looked good at 4 locations. So we do have several options out there for high yields, effective weed management. Those newer traits were among the highest yielding, but may not always be better than existing varieties, particularly under drought years. A lot of times those things just evened out. And then under the current economics, we did favor some of the newer technologies and also those non-GMO soybeans with premiums. So that's kind of a brief overview. This just happens to be a picture of that particular study on campus, and it was pretty large. It was a big task, but I don't know if we have any time for
a couple questions.
Behind you. Okay. Or maybe there isn't any. But
East Lansing precipitation for 2011.
Higher
than normal?
Higher than normal, yeah. Yeah. That's the premium. So that's the addition to your seed cost. So think of like the premium part. So I didn't buy seed for $20. I wish I could buy seed for $23. Yeah.
What kind of fertility program?
Our fertility program, a lot of those fields are probably manured every 3 years.
So trials with liquid?
We're not putting, we're not doing any liquid or anything like that. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks, Christie. This was most likely the last year for that. When the Ready 2s came on and the Liberties were gaining interest, why our soybean board said, hey, this looks like something we need to look at. We looked at it, and there is a place for the non-GMOs, obviously, with the pre